Wow, it's great to see all of you today for this 50-second lunch and learn seminar from the ESSEC Philanthropy Chair. I think we can get started now. So again, a big thank you for signing up for this webinar. I'm really happy to welcome you. And before telling you more about the content of today, I would just like to remind you a few housekeeping rules. By default, your camera should be on and your microphones are off. If you can introduce yourself by your name, it's very convenient. So you can do a right click on your own name in Zoom and type your name, your full name, and if you want the organization that you're working for. To ask questions to our two guests, it's quite easy. You can use the chat, so we will have a look at all your questions while our guests are presenting. In the chat, you will also find a lot of resources that both the chair's team and our guests are sharing with you on this topic. So keep an eye on the chat and don't hesitate to use it to ask questions. After each presentation, we will have some time for taking all the questions. And it's also possible at that time to raise your hand if you want to ask your questions directly to all the team. The webinar is being recorded, so it's great to know that you can have another opportunity to rewatch this on YouTube. We publish all our lunch and learn webinars on YouTube after the presentation happens. So thank you so much for being there. I think we can now jump to the presentation of the topic of the day and our guests. So the presentation, the theme of the webinar is Philanthropy for Systems Change, What Foundations Can Do. I'm very happy to organize this because it's a topic that the ESSEC Philanthropy Chair has explored over the past 3 years now, together with other actors in France within the collective called Racine. And I'm really happy to have Elsa D'Acosta from Ashoka, France, who's a big part of this collective with us today. This is a topic that really matters, I think, for philanthropy, especially since, I think we witnessed about 10 years ago a systems turn in the nonprofit sector, especially in the US. What we call a renewed interest for systems thinking applied to the nonprofit sector and social and environmental issues. And in this field, in this conversation, the role of philanthropic funders has been discussed as an area in which progress could be made by switching the traditional grant-making habits to, I would say, a more systemic way of supporting nonprofit and social enterprises with a systems mindset. And this is what we are going to talk about. So especially the role of philanthropy, grant-making foundations, private foundations in funding and allowing system change leaders to operate on the field in various causes. So this is the topic of the day, and I'm very happy to welcome two distinguished guests to discuss that with us today. First, Professor Maria Bisharoff. Hello, Maria. It's great to have you. Maria is a professor of organizations and impact at the Said Business School at the Oxford University, and she's also the academic director of the Skoll Center that you probably have heard of at Oxford. Maria, we are delighted to have you. It's your work on hybrid organization and social entrepreneurship has been a source of influence and inspiration for many scholars. So we are very happy to have you, and we know that at Oxford and at the Skoll Center in particular, you have worked on this systemic approach, and Maya will present what they do at Skoll and also a different programs that they run at the center, especially the Map the Systems initiative, and also Maria will share some of her research on system change and systems perspectives in organization and management theory more broadly. So thank you so much, Maria, for being here. I'm also happy to welcome Sylvia Steisel. Hello, Sylvia. Sylvia is currently the Director Europe for Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. It's a new role, I think, and a new position that Sylvia has taken a few weeks ago, a few months ago now. So Sylvia we got to know each other when Sylvia was the Managing Director of the De Groof Petercam Foundation in Belgium. I've worked with Sylvia and her team on a case study about De Groof Petercam Foundation's strategic revision. It was great because we had the opportunity to unpack what a foundation can do to change its strategy, to adopt a systemic mindset. So Sylvia will obviously share her journey with system change and tell us what foundations can do based on her experience at the Groof Petercam Foundation. It's going to be a very concrete example. So I'm sure we will all learn from both of you. So thank you so much for being there. And thank you also to Elsa Da Costa from Ashoka. We'll ask a few questions in a few minutes as well to our two guests. So I think now it's time to start our seminar. So we will start with, like we like to do, a first poll to get a sense of what all of you think and know about systems thinking. So the poll will appear now on Zoom. So please take a few seconds to answer the poll. How familiar are you with systems thinking applied to social and environmental issues? So take a few seconds to answer. We'll share the results in a few seconds. So that's great. More than 60 of you have answered. How familiar are you with system thinking applied to social and environmental issues? So as you can see, there are 5 choices, from not at all to expert. A few seconds left, maybe, for those of you who haven't voted yet. It's great. There's 100 people in the room. We're almost there. I think we can, share the results now to all our participants. So yes, as you can see, we are in the middle. So most of you describe themselves as either novice or familiar with system thinking. So I think it's about two-thirds of our audience today in the middle categories. A few beginners, 13% not at all, and a few experts and knowledgeable. But it's great to see the distribution, so we can also adapt our conversation to your own knowledge. So thanks a lot for doing that. And I think now it's time for Maria to start and take the floor. So Maria, would you like to hello first? It's great to have you.
Thank you, Artur. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. And so I'll give a little bit of a background on myself and the Skoll Center and talk about the work that we're doing on systems thinking and systems change approaches, both from the teaching and educational side, but also from the research side. And I have some slides to share.
Yeah, that's great. You should be able to share them, Maria, if you want to.
Okay, so shall I share them directly?
Yeah, it's better because then you can control the pace. I think it's great.
Perfect. Okay, I'll just get those up as we start talking.
Yes.
And what I am going to do first is give you a bit of background on the Skoll Center. So the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship was founded 20 years ago, really one of the first centers on social entrepreneurship and social innovation based in a business school at the time. So sort of early days in business schools starting to take these issues seriously. And at that point in time, our focus was very much on social entrepreneurship, not systemic change. And it's only more recently that we've gotten into focusing on systems change. And so in the early days, really, we were founded to help build the field of social entrepreneurship and to help build the field in practice and in research and in public engagement. And so one of the hallmarks of our early activities was to host, which we still do, the School World Forum. And the forum brings together social innovators globally from around the world to come to Oxford to celebrate each other, to learn from each other, to be inspired. And it was really a seminal event early on that helped to really create knowledge around and community around social entrepreneurship. Alongside the forum, we have from the beginning also on the educational side engaged in a scholarship program for accomplished social entrepreneurs to come to Oxford to study for the MBA. And this was part of our efforts to build the educational programming around social entrepreneurship. First, to introduce business students to social entrepreneurs, and then to really shift the curriculum inside business schools. So that was the educational component. And we started early on with a chaired professorship in social entrepreneurship that my colleague Alex Nichols holds and still holds to this day. And that represented the early seeds of the research component. So those were our origins, excuse me. And we have adapted from that base. So you can see here, the images on this slide are just some of the people who were involved in the early days. Jeff Skoll up there on the top left, Sally Osberg, who led the Skoll Foundation at that time and the dean of the business school at the time on the right, and then some of our Skoll scholars. Those are our origins. Today, we actually look rather different, and the field has evolved considerably. And of course, today we're talking about systems change, and that's very much become the focus of our work at the Skoll Center. But I think I start with these origins because the way we come at systems change and what we have learned about it comes in part, not only, but in part from having spent many years working with social entrepreneurs who are starting ventures on the ground, and trying to understand what was the nature of that work, what did it take to succeed, and from that we have both recognized that a lot of what they were starting to do was to try to shift the systems in which they operated, not just to advance a particular product or service, and also to recognize that there was a real need to look not just at social ventures, but at the other sets of organizing processes that are going on that are complementary, all of which are required to drive systemic change. So where we are going now is very much as we currently, and as we look to the future, we are broadening our focus, having our roots in social entrepreneurship, to look at fundamental processes of systemic change. As we do that, we're really trying to strengthen our research capabilities and thought leadership in that space. And we're bringing that into our educational programs, where we really try to bridge research and practice, and taking those programs beyond Oxford to work with practicing social entrepreneurs globally. And so what I'm going to talk about is some of the ways that we're doing that on the teaching side, the curricular or co-curricular side, and then on the research side around systems change. Again, always at this intersection that you can see with the three circles of research, education, and practice. We're really guided by, as we do this work and do our research and our teaching around systems change, we're really guided by the vision that you see here on this slide, which is fundamentally about embracing paradox, that what we need to really drive social change is people and approaches that bridge what often are divides, theory and practice, profit and purpose, local communities and global businesses, and that's what's core to really finding ways of transforming broken systems. And so you'll see this in a thread, I think, throughout what I talk about, but also in all of our other work. And we, one level down from that vision, we work across what we call 4 pillars, 4 processes that we think are core to systemic change. And I think, again, hopefully we can get into what does this mean in your organizations. I'm going to talk about these at sort of an abstract level here. Leadership and organizing. What are the leadership practices and organizing approaches that are needed? Financing and partnerships more broadly. What forms of financing can support systemic change? And that will obviously be a central focus of our conversation today. But we also look at measurement and how can we measure systems change efforts in a way that still remains grounded and meaningful for the people, organizations, and communities that are at the heart of those efforts. And then finally, scaling, which is, of course, systems change is all about scaling. But here, thinking about scaling as not just scaling up in a more narrow sense, but also scaling deeply and broadly, which might mean working in a handful of communities, but quite intensively across a range of issues and so on. So that's the set of things that we're working on. Let me now tell you about, I'm going to go through in my time 3 specific pieces that we've done around systems thinking and systems change to give you a flavor of how we understand this. So the first, and I'm not going to quite go chronologically, but this is the first piece. This program is called Map the System. It has its origins in 2015-16 when we were really starting to bring a systems perspective into our work. And the idea of Map the System is that before you jump to solutions, you've got to understand the context. I mean, it's pretty basic, but often, especially working in a business school context, we have students and practitioners who come through who are focused on what's the intervention, right? Or what's the business plan? And this was meant to be sort of an anti-business plan approach, where the idea in this program is that we are teaching participants how to understand the context, the system that gives rise to a social problem as a means of then figuring out how to intervene. What are the possible ways of shifting that system rather than just jumping to a solution? Right now, this program is offered to university students globally. We've had around 65 partner institutions in the most recent offering. And what we teach them is fundamentally a systems approach to understanding complex problems. And so we start by helping them see, widen the aperture, right? So if they're interested in a particular issue in their local community, how can they start to see the range of players involved, the range of relationships that are creating the problem, and that might need to be shifted or disrupted to start to address it. We teach them research methods for learning about systems. So obviously they're in academic institutions, right? They know how to do academic research, but we help them understand what's the value of what we call apprenticing with the problem. How can they start to really be present with the issue that they're trying to address, to start to learn about the system that's keeping problematic relations and processes in place by really being on the ground with participants in that system. And then we go through a set of systems mapping tools that they can use, and we use some quite traditional ones. And I think you'll hear from Sylvia about some of these, and you'll see some as well. But really fundamentally, the tools are meant to say, not to help you map relationships, but also to help you surface underlying assumptions and power dynamics that are perpetuating social problems. And then finally, and only finally, we move from analysis to action. So how can you identify intervention points for shifting the system in some way that doesn't solve the problem, but starts to set in motion a different set of dynamics? So that's the sort of essence of Map the System. I'm very happy to talk more about it during the discussion. But we think there's actually real potential, and we're excited about bringing this program to a much broader range of people who are practicing doing work on social change. So looking well beyond university students. You can see on the right here just some of the participants and some of the topics that have been covered. What's really magical about this, and I think this is really important in systems change work, is that we bring the students together, the finalists from each institution globally for a convening in Oxford. And that is really a chance to learn from one another, to learn from leading systems thinking practitioners, And this is where things really come to life because the learning program is helpful. It can be abstract. The students have grounded that in particular projects and they share with one another. So that's not the system. That's the way in which we've taught systems thinking to others. What I want to do now is shift to two research initiatives that we have going on and recently completed that give you some of the thinking behind this, right? What is sort of fueling the insights in this program? And I hope will help you to understand what would it mean to bring a systems perspective to your work. So the first is a piece of work. I will say from the start, is a purely academic piece of work. I'm going to translate. It's really about what I would call thinking in systems, but really, what does it mean to think in systems? And this is based on a massive review of academic perspectives in organization and management research on systems approaches to understanding social dynamics and social problems. We've reviewed all the top journals in organization management research, gone through over 500 articles, as well as seminal books. And I'm just going to highlight two things that have come out of this review, because there's a lot of systems perspectives, right? There's early roots in general systems theory. There's social systems perspectives. There's system dynamics, system psychodynamics, socio-technical systems, social ecological systems, systems thinking, complex systems. I think I've named almost all the main ones, but you get the idea. There's a lot of these are kind of, they might seem to each be quite different. Fundamentally, what they share is the following, that they all see in various ways social phenomena as comprised of interdependent elements that constitute a dynamic whole. So this notion of interdependence and this notion that the relations among parts in a system add up to more than just the sum of the parts, right? That there are these interactions in a system that create emergent outcomes. And you can't just study one element in isolation. Those are core aspects of systems perspectives. And so what does this mean for people who are trying to work and think in systems on the ground? I just want to highlight three things here. So one is that all of these perspectives imply a broadening of scope. So thinking about a wider set of elements or factors that are influencing a focal problem or issue that you're trying to address. In academic research, we would talk about this as we need to broaden the boundaries of our research, right? We need to think about, for example, not just what an organization is doing, but how is that organization situated in a particular political context, cultural context, beyond just the set of sort of stakeholder, supplier relationships, partners, et cetera, really thinking more deeply about the context. That's the first implication. The second is that we really need to think about relationships differently, non-linearity, unintended consequences. You'll, I think, hear from Sylvia about feedback loops and all of, sort of really taking account of the complexity of interdependencies. It's quite important. And then we get to the intervention, right? So then once you've done that sort of systems mapping, identifying leverage points. So Danella Meadows talks about leverage points as the places in a system where a small change in one thing produces a big change in everything, right? And that is really, really powerful. And it's obviously embodied in Meadows' work, but there's aspects of that in all these different systems perspectives. So this review, I hope helps to give you a sense of sort of what does it mean to think in systems, right? How do we sort of widen the aperture, allow for unintended consequences, attend to interactions and dynamics, and think about this as sort of something that's in motion, right? Rather than a static and narrow sort of cause-effect relationship, much more complexity. Okay, that's the research. The last piece I want to talk about is another piece of research we did, but this was research on how both social enterprises and funders are doing systems change in practice. And what you're going to see is that the way it's being done does not match completely the thinking in systems idea that I just talked about. And so we see a disconnect. And I'm going to invite you to think about how to reconnect those. So this is a piece of work that we did a few years back. We called it the Systems Change Observatory. And this was a research initiative. It was supported by the Skoll Foundation, our main funder. it had a dual objectives of really analyzing what does systems change mean for social entrepreneurs and for funders. And so this was motivated by, in part what's brought us here today, right? There's a lot of interest in this. There's a lot of recognition in the social sector that systems change is what we should be focusing on. We need to widen beyond individual organizations, but what does that mean and how do we do it? And so instead of saying, in this research, we didn't want to come and say, normatively, this is how you do it. We wanted to descriptively go out and catalog what are people doing? And then from that to build to recommendations and implications. And so we went about this really in two ways. So one was looking at the social ventures themselves. And we gathered data on over 100 social entrepreneurial ventures over a 15-year period. That helped us to see how are the social ventures approaching this. And then separately, we gathered data from interviews and archival materials on funders spanning global north and global south, and people who'd been involved at various points over the past 20 years in philanthropy, and were now doing something about systems change. And what we found, I'm going to talk through this, and then I think we've posted a link in the chat to the paper that provides much more detail. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I'll just give a high-level overview here of the two kinds of findings. So first, on the venture side, we found a lot of sort of broad talk about the system impacts that were intended. And in the language of a logic model, we're talking here about outcomes and impacts. But often that was quite decoupled from the actual organizational model. So if you think in terms of the logic model, the sort of discourse around what are we going for, what intended outcomes and impacts we're going to have, didn't match what we saw on sort of like the left-hand side of a logic model on what ventures were actually doing. And so we really see this split. And you might think, well, that might make sense. There's a lot of pressure to sort of think in terms of systems change, and there's sort of a lag in ventures really shifting their activities to actually live that out. And so that suggested of an opportunity, I would say, to really help social ventures couple or better align their organizational activities with their intended impacts. Like there's a desire to get there, but there's sort of a lag in organizing and acting accordingly, right? So that's on the social venture side. And then perhaps most interesting for this group, on the funder side, when funders talked about systems change, they meant very different things. And we find 5 different models of systems change that are evident in funders' practices and in the discourse that they were using. And some of those models map somewhat closely to what I described as thinking in systems, but some really don't map at all, frankly. And so it suggests that there's sort of really a wide array of ways that this concept is being used, and that I think there would be benefit from thinking about, well, which of these are really shifting systems and which are doing something else, which may also have a positive impact, but it's not really shifting a system. So I just talked briefly, there's in italics at the bottom in the paper that's linked, there's a table that lays them all out, and there's plenty of text that explains them all. So one model is what we call empowering change makers. And this is should be quite familiar to many of you here who've been in this space for a while. Simply here, we're talking about celebrating, focusing, supporting individuals who are understood to have exceptional qualities that allow them to enact change. So it's labeled as systems change, but it's very much focused on individuals. The second and related model is what we call scaling up, which should also be quite familiar, builds on the sort of Silicon Valley model of sort of venture capital investment to scale up a venture. The notion here is that investing in initiatives or organizations with the idea of replicating and taking to scale. And so this too, has familiar echoes of past approaches, and it has value, and it's not the kind of very broad, take account of context, think about unintended consequences and relationships. It doesn't have that in it, right? So I just highlight those as sort of known models, don't totally match the systems and thinking ideas that I just described. Then there's three others that to varying degrees start to shift towards more of a what I would say is sort of a deep systems approach. So one is focused on coordinating actors. So here the idea is recognizing no one venture or organization or initiative can fully tackle the focal problem that the funder is trying to address. The funder is investing to link up different organizations to help build an ecosystem of connected entities that can collectively address the problem. So that starts to broaden the aperture a little bit, has echoes of some of this thinking in systems approach. Experimenting and exploring, this has echoes in a different way. This is really about funders going in, trying small scale interventions or supporting particular programs, learning and adapting as they go, getting to know the local context, seeding different experiments in that context that might address the problem area, and then adapting from that. And so this has echoes of thinking in systems in terms of the notion that things are interrelated, that there's complex outcomes that emerge from those interrelationships, and that we can't solve, but we can sort of set in motion and learn as we set in motion. And then the final one of scaling deep picks up on a different aspect of thinking in systems, which is really about the notion that there are deep values, assumptions, and political dynamics that underpin systems and that need to be ultimately disrupted if we're going to shift systems. And so scaling deep is about getting to know local communities in depth and really trying to understand and then intervene on the institutional arrangements and the political dynamics in those communities that hold things in place and that can potentially unlock change. So hopefully that gives you a flavor of the varied ways that systems change can operate on the ground, and the different ways that it can pick up on or not pick up on what I would say it means to sort of think in systems. I'm going to leave you with a provocation, which is, given this variety of ways that funders are pursuing systems change, given what you've heard about what thinking in systems involves, what would it mean for you in your work to use a systems perspective? How could you use a systems perspective to guide your work? I'll leave it with that, and I look forward to the conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Maria, for this presentation. It was very enlightening, and I think it gives us also a lot of food for thought and things on which Sylvia can elaborate with a concrete case at the Grove Petercam Foundation. We have a few minutes for questions, clarification questions, especially. We will have ample time for debate after the second presentation, but as I suggested, maybe I will pass the microphone to Elsa Da Costa from Ashoka, France, maybe to ask the first question to Maria based on her presentation. Elsa?
Thank you. Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, Maria. As Arthur said, thank you so much, Maria, to share your research and reflection. It's truly impressive and relieving in a sense to see that we are many to work in the same way, especially in those times, in the political times, especially in France, as you can everybody know. Most of the time, systems change is seen as clinical or cold and not full of flesh and bone. Whereas in many occasions, we observe that the link, and especially relations, is a key part of system change. I mean founders and social entrepreneurs, for instance, but in every pieces of our lives, basically. So during your speech, a sentence drew my attention. You were talking about embracing paradox rather than embracing complexity. And I think the meaning of the word is quite different. Would you say that using this expression, I mean embracing paradox, contribute to change mindset in creating a new leadership to operate system change and a new way of managing community, especially when we talk about cognitive bias or mental schemes, for instance?
Yeah, thank you, Elsa. It's a great question. I mean, I think you're, so for sure, I just want to say, first of all, like, I think you're completely right. This sort of the relational and the emotional aspects of systems change are super important. And there are many approaches and perspectives that don't highlight them. And there are others that do, but they haven't, I think, to date really been brought into this conversation. So think, for example, I don't know if any of you know much about systems psychodynamics, right? The interplay of conscious and unconscious forces, the role of emotions are so central in that perspective, which has mainly been used to understand individual and group dynamics. It has its origins, of course, in thinking about democracy and sort of being very concerned about authoritarianism. And so it certainly has its roots in much more macro issues. That's just one perspective that really highlights emotion, but I just wanted to really emphasize super important. And this is embedded in the sort of paradox both and, right? Those are valuable. And so is something like a systems dynamics approach that allows you to sort of map relations and draw a nice diagram. And so it's really both together. I do think that this notion of paradox is quite different than complexity. And there's huge value in thinking about complexity. What complexity doesn't highlight is precisely, as you say, the sort of emotional and relational dynamics. And a paradox approach, I think, very much has the potential to bring that in. I mean, what we mean by paradox is the sort of recognizing that competing demands are also interrelated and synergistic. And there's not just tensions and conflict, but there's also the possibility of integration and synergy. And that approach and that sort of a paradox mindset can open us up to being able to understand, to take in different points of view, to be more open to finding ways of collaborating while recognizing differences, to finding ways of experimenting and trying new approaches because we're able to see things from different perspectives.
Thank you so much, Maria.
Thank you, Elsa. Thank you, Maria. Do we have questions in the chat? I think no, so far I haven't seen one. We may have time for one question, again, based on Maria's presentation. We will have ample time for other questions after Sylvia's, obviously. So if you want to ask maybe one question before we move on to the next presentation, it's possible. You can either raise your hand or write it in the chat. If I don't see questions here, I can also invite you to keep your questions maybe for the second part of the conversation. So don't hesitate to use the chat. As you know, ideas flow. You may have questions on Maria's and then Sylvia's presentation. Use the chat to ask your questions and send your comments, and our team will be able to bring them up for the discussion. So I propose to switch to Sylvia's presentation now. So thanks a lot, Maria, and we'll keep the conversation going after Sylvia's presentation. So Sylvia, before you take the floor, I have a second poll to share with you, right? Because we like to do that before each presentation to engage our audience. So here's the second one. Have you ever mapped the system? So it's just something that Maya mentioned just before. Have you ever mapped the system that generates or reinforces the problematic social or environmental issues that your organization tries to tackle? So basically, the idea is, have you ever done this work of mapping the different parts of a system that generates the problem that you try to tackle, and the interactions and the relationship between these parts? And of course, there are many methods. So if you want to share a method, you can use it in the chat. Tell us what you used to do that. So a few more seconds to answer. Have you ever mapped the system with any method? So we will share the results in maybe 5 seconds. So thanks to all of you who have voted. Okay, I think we can share the results now. Okay, so as you can see, most of you have not, 60%, but 23%, so 16 of you have said yes. And so to those of you who said yes, please, don't hesitate to share your how you did it in the chat in a few words. And for those of you who are not sure, it's fine. We will have a good example now with Sylvia's presentation. So thank you so much again, Sylvia, for being there. Do you want to take to share your screen, maybe to show your slides?
I will. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to see some familiar faces and many new ones. So, okay, do you see my screen? Perfect.
Yes.
So, yeah, thank you for giving me this occasion to share my experience and my work. And thanks for this first part, Maria and Arthur. It's very interesting to hear, different perspectives. And I think, Arthur, you asked me to participate to this conversation with this practical view of someone who lived the experience of implementing this type of philanthropy at the level of a foundation. So just about me and my journey in philanthropy. So I worked in cultural and philanthropy patronage to start with. And then I joined the financial sector where I developed a philanthropy advisory service to unlock private capital towards philanthropy. And then I was managing a foundation, which is called the Groove Petercam Foundation that you mentioned, for the last 7 years until April this year. And I changed role to join the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors as a director Europe. So I'm also on the board of my family foundation, working since 4th generation on the topic of mental disability. And all these experiences have actually proved and shown me that you can actually practice system change and that it works. So I'm an advocate of this type of philanthropy. I also acknowledge that it's not the only way of doing philanthropy. You can do aid or invest in medical research, for instance. You don't have to do system change, but for very complex situations, it's something that's quite useful, and you will see, and I hope I can show how it manifests in the field. So maybe the first reaction when I talk to fellow, foundation leaders and directors, first reaction are very much about, it's too big for us. It's for the Rockefellers and the Gates of this world. It's not for us. And second reaction, it's too theoretical, it's conceptual. And as I said, it's cold. And that's something that comes quite often back in conversation. And last reaction is, yes, it's nice, it's very interesting, but practically speaking, how do you put this in place? So I'm going to share the case of the foundation I have led for 7 years, being there as managing director, having to convince, having to really understand how it works in practice. So maybe it's also occasion to tackle the first question, is systems change only for big funders? Well, actually, no, because the Groove Petercam Foundation is big in Belgium, but it's a small foundation when you compare it to usual suspects. I mean, it's 2 million budget a year. So it's not a big foundation, but yet, it found ways to act and implement this. So very briefly, this foundation funds social innovation for employment in Europe and in Belgium. It has evolved over the last 10 years from a reactive philanthropy to a strategic philanthropic model, and pace by pace has, through experience, discovered and adopted a systems change philanthropy. So I know it's after lunch, and I want to wake you with a very simple question that you can put in the chat. So I hope you can answer this question. I think we're all here for the same reason. Very quickly, what pops to your mind when you think of the role of philanthropy? I'm very curious, very quickly. Okay, you let me know when you have enough material. Okay. Okay. Well, they're all different, so it's good. It shows a variety of perspectives as well. Okay. So I'm leaving this chat now. So, well, if I answer this question, I would say it's about solving problems, and especially very complex problems. And, if it's too theoretical or conceptual, actually, no, it's quite simple. System change is acknowledging the fact that problems are created by a specific context or system, and that this context needs to change. And that's very simply, that system change is to, go to the root causes that create this problem and perpetuate it over and over again. So, practically speaking, this is sharing my personal perception on the systems change, concepts. And if we take the example of employment problems, so on the right, this is a very hideous man and monster and giant. This is Goliath. And he is, let's say, as an example, long-term unemployment. It's a big problem. So this problem is causing a lot of trouble and damage. Like Goliath, he's enormous, he's strongly rooted, he's super scary to face, and the world will be much better off without him. And in front of him, you have this poor little David, and he's known as the philanthropist. And yeah, he's super small, but he's super agile. He's smart, he's audacious, and he's known to aim very well. And he has one single stone to overthrow him. So, practically speaking, what can foundation do to be as smart as David? I think the first thing that's really important is to mention that you have to know your enemy and where your single stone can hit. That is, I think, the main learning of these years in the field. And I can translate this in 5 elements. I think the first one is to narrow your focus. You can't fight too many Goliaths at the same time. I mean, it's even if you're a big foundation, they're so complex, so big. Second point is really to work on your problem statements. And you have to know what you fight and what would be the result if this fight was won. Third is to deconstruct the problem to find how you can identify root causes of this problem. Then mapping the system, we discussed this before, is to understand the dynamics that keep this problem in place. And then at the 5th level, you can identify the entry points where your stone can actually make a difference. So here again, taking the example of DPF, what happened at first finding your focus? How do you do this in practice? Well, it started with a study that was commissioned to an academic to find the specific groups and underserved topics on employment in Europe and the countries where they were active. So this research allowed to identify some groups of people and some specific problems that were not very much addressed or underserved, and such as the topic as women and underemployment. And so the foundation decided to narrow down to Belgium because, you have to make choices, and they felt that that was the place where they could have the best leverage. And then based on first research, they identified the topic of parenthood as being a driver of women underemployment. And so they looked at what's happening in the field and the nonprofits, what is this topic, how does this world look like to answer this question? And so they decided to steer a new initiative because, there was a bit of potential to, bring some more strength in this response. So that's the example to about the focus. And then working on your problem statements. This is something that's very much overlooked in philanthropy. And believe me, it takes so much time and so much effort to really express what you want to do and what the problem you want to tackle, because you have to prove it's urgent, it's a big problem, you have to face it. And it's also very useful to convince other funders, nonprofits to work with you, your board, all your stakeholders that need to follow you. And this took ages, but it is very important to express where you work, with whom you want to work, what's the problem, and what's the driver in something simple and compelling. And also work on prospection. What would be the situation if the problem was solved? What's the destination? What does success look like? That's super important, but it gives the motivation for people to join you. So I don't want to scare you with this slide because it's a bit heavy, but this is just a technique to show you how you can deconstruct the problem. This is a method to allow you to have a good understanding of what keeps the problem in place and find the root causes. So very practically, what's the result of this work? Well, it's starting with your problem and spending as much time as possible with people that are, experts that live this situation, parents, women in this case. These are hours and hours of coffee drinking, building relationships, trustful relationships. And here comes also the human part that we just discussed. It's a lot of, human power and human dynamics that come into this space. And here it allows you to map really the different drivers of the problem and which one you could potentially tackle. So this is a summary of different conversations with different kind of people that gives you this understanding. So it's called a fishbone diagram, very useful. You can also use this in workshops with your beneficiaries, for instance. So then mapping the system, this is another way of visualizing the problem. System change is also a lot of visualization. Okay, having this helicopter view of a problem and try to understand, okay, how it works, who is at stake, what are the dynamics, the powers behind it. So this is also a tool, the mapping, it's a loops of problems. I'm sure some of you have used it before, is to see, okay, what is in interconnected. And we spoke about this earlier too. So this is just to show that we started by identifying, okay, what's happening when a woman has her first child in terms of employment. And this is the loop of problems that follow. And this loop of problems serves another loop of problems that arises, which is putting natality at risk. And this is also leading to another problem, which is childhood health and childcare. So this is all interrelated, and you have to see it in a lens that you can not, tackle all of this, but being aware and also finding potential partners. So here we come again to this, visualization of the problem. And this is also helpful because now you want to be as agile as David, and you want to know where you can actually act. And by deconstructing the problem, you can find entry points. Entry points are sweet spots where a foundation or you as a philanthropist, you can actually do something concretely. And in this case, it was, after all these conversations around parenthood and parents, we really heard that mothers and parents said that it really looked like a taboo topic in Belgium, a very private subject that's some people don't even consider it as a problem, that was very much under the radar. So that was the first way of thinking, okay, maybe we can do something about it. Just talk about it, open a conversation, have a media attention, and have this conversation happening also during election time. So that was the first sweet spot for this foundation at that time, and it's actually currently still happening in Belgium, is to find the right team for this limited period of time to tackle this entry point and then build on that. Because I think that the most difficult thing when you want to practice system change, and how do you start? This is an enormous question. How do you just start? It's just so overwhelming. So that's a easy way to say, okay, maybe we enter this way. So this is an example where a foundation was in the driver's seat of leading system change, taking the lead. And we didn't talk about leadership here, but it's also a very important part of governance and leadership. And this is another example of DPF where they have another program where they have a little bit more distance and where they fund social system changers. So that's another way of doing it. You can support these system changers in the field and help them to deploy their work. And how did they do this? Well, the initial problem that I identified is it's really hard to innovate in employment. It's hard, it's difficult, it's long-term, and it's really hard to finance too. But if you want to finance something as a foundation, you need to find this organization able to do this and address the challenge. So what did DPF do? They select one very promising social innovator in the space of employment every year, and they give them an unrestricted grant of 1 million euros. So that's a way of, scaling them and helping them to become game-changing. And then the question is, well, how do you find these people? How do you find this organization? I mean, they're super specific. Well, this is a list of typical features that DPF has, from its experience in the field. And I'm not going to list all of them, but specifically, you will see very highly skilled people, quite senior profiles, people with very well-documented plans and research-based. You will also see that the work they do is not very marketable. It's sometimes very hard to explain, even if they're very convincing. And typically, I mean, when I have this aha moment, when I see a system change, is like they think very differently. They see the problem in a very different way, and you're like, oh, this is interesting. Oh yes, I didn't see it this way. So this is typically featuring a social system changer. And we must say they are the least common in the sector, so it's very important to have them and spot them and find them. And typically, what are their needs? Well, the first thing, and I'm sure you're all aware, is that they enter your selection process, because it's really hard for them to fit into these boxes. They don't address a typical, one problem. We have seen it's all interrelated. They don't really come up with solutions. Sometimes they just come up with a technique or methodology that addresses problems. So it's really hard for them to enter your processes. So that's the first thing to have in mind. They also need very, very modern ways of funding, long-term, unrestricted, because they need to attract talent. They need to retain these talents, also need long-term relationships with partners to really understand what they do and have interest in what they do and can provide this kind of holistic support. And also a lot of patience. I mean, it's super hard to change a system. So you need a bit of patience and also a bit of, comprehensiveness that it's hard and it can also fail. Again, these are examples of the response of DPF, ranging from different types of interventions in their way of doing, such as, in their selection process, adding these elements that feature this system changers to have them, coming up in your process, state-of-the-art funding, trust over control. All these are elements that were implemented step by step and that enhance this capability of the foundation to support system changers. And also, I can share some difficulties. Of course, it hasn't been a very easy way, and navigating this can bring some difficulties along. So I'm not listing everything, but I think it ranges from, onboarding your board, communication challenges. It's also long term, so it's, an effort that you have to look over time. Implementation is hard, working with trust is hard, and accepting failure and a kind of tolerance to risk is super important as well. But if I can recall one major difficulty, my experience from leading this foundation is trying to onboard your board. If you come to your board and say, okay, today we're going to change from a new strategy, we're going to be system changers. This is typically the reaction you will have from your board. What are you talking about? This is a bit too, the board is too far away from operations to understand really what's system change in the field. And I think I would say if I had to share some thoughts on this, the way I would have presented this is probably do it step by step, onboard your board, board after board, explain examples how you can do philanthropy better, what are their needs, what is system change, like I would say acupunctural way of doing, because otherwise it would be like, we don't understand it, this is a massive change, this is too overwhelming, and they don't follow you. And again, this is strategy, but it's very much about, operational work, changing your way you organize your selection process, the way you create the relationship with your grantee. So it's a lot of operation that, the operational team has to take leadership on. So it's not your board who will do the work. So I think you have to, if you are in the driver's seat of a foundation or fund, you have to believe that you are going to show the way and you have to implement this. It's not your board who's deciding this. So here comes my conclusion. Well, system change is very difficult. That's a no-brainer. It's hard, it's difficult, it's long-term. But if you remember David, you can be big or super small, as long as you're agile, smart, and audacious. If you concentrate on aiming well, and with small actions over time, you can actually overthrow a problem. And I hope you all know the end of the story between David and Goliath, but he actually wins in the end. So that's also the good sign, is to show that, no matter the scale, as long as you know what to do, you want to do it smartly. So that's about my experience. Also very happy to share, Q&A. And also if you want to self-diagnose your organization in the way it's operating system change, you can also follow this Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisor's self-diagnostic tool, which is very useful to see, okay, where am I? What are the typical elements that I can implement or still already do? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for this. It was very complementary with what Maria outlined in our first presentation. Before we open the floor to all of your questions, and also I think it's great if Maria and Sylvia can also react to the presentations, to each other's presentation. I would like to again give the floor to Elsa from Ashoka France. Elsa, do you want to ask a specific question to Sylvia?
Yes, thank you so much, Sylvia, for the clarity and the pragmatism and efficiency of your vision and contribution of the world. I keep to focus on hemming well. I love this expression. I think, yes, we have to hemming well. I really want to say that I appreciate the fact that you put philanthropy in an entrepreneurial way, because in many cases, the one who is seen as a problem solver is the social entrepreneur itself. Qualify the philanthropy as a problem solver as well, show that in a system change, we need to be a team driven by the same objectives. And would you say that that kind of assertion help rebalance a little bit the relationship between social entrepreneur and the founders, and how we can accelerate the self-perception of philanthropy action as a problem solver than a problem savior?
Interesting question. Thank you. Well, I think, of course, my vision of philanthropy is that it should be entrepreneurial. Philanthropy is the ultimate risk capital. So it has to take this risk. And I always saw it as an investment fund, and you fund entrepreneurs, who do the work. But sometimes you don't have these entrepreneurs who can do the work. So you have to do it yourself. So you have to build a solution as a foundation. That's when you operate. And yeah, you have to see, I think, the perception of philanthropy is that I always also like to think the added value of a foundation is also to spend all this time on this problem, because we always jump to solutions. And it's the privilege of philanthropy to really take a step back, understand the problem, dig into the problem, find it. Who else would do it? I mean, there's no one out there who will really map your problem. So if you cannot do this, I mean, it's not a social entrepreneur who has to do it. He comes and he fixes and he works and he's a system changer. He can do it in a better way. But it's the ultimate role of the foundation to prepare everything that's possible for this social entrepreneur to come and jump in. I think that's my vision.
Yes, mine too. Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you so much, Elsa, for opening the floor for questions. Maria, I think you had some comments based on Sylvia's presentation. Do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you so much. Sylvia, that was fantastic. Thank you. And really for sort of grounding this discussion in a real live example of what this has looked like on the ground, which I think is super important. I just want to react to a few things. And the first one picks up on Elsa's question. So I think, this issue of collaboration, funder to social entrepreneur, but also funder to funder, and across different issues is really important if we're trying to talk about doing systems change. And there were two links that I think were shared as I was talking. One of them was the paper I described with the 5 different models that funders have adopted in enacting systems change. But the other is a link to a report called The Decisive Decade. And it focuses on collaborating for climate action. We produced it a few years ago. So, but I think it very much still holds. And what I want to highlight is that it focuses exactly on this issue of how can we start thinking differently about collaborating? Again, funders to ventures or initiatives, funder to funder, and then cross issue, cross geography, because I mean, especially on climate, but in all types of systems change efforts, that is going to be essential. And that requires sort of, again, it's sort of this broadening of the aperture, right? It's not just sort of one funder to one org, but a much broader set of relationships that we need to consider. So that's the first thing I wanted to highlight. I think this collaboration piece is super important. The second is that, Sylvia, you were talking about funding systems changers, essentially. And I think, that, for example, the Skoll Foundation would talk about the same thing in this language of funding systems orchestrators, right? And I think that is, I just want to highlight, like, that is an approach here, which is to think about how can funders find people who are doing systems change work and support them. And in a way that fits into that first model that I described of funding, empowering change makers. There are I want to contrast that with a different approach, which is to really sort of fund systems change work, or sort of instead of finding people who are doing that work, to really, as a funder, go in and sort of support an array of activities and initiatives that together gets you towards systems change. And both are viable approaches, but they are quite different, right? And I think sometimes we've sort of overemphasized the funding changers or funding individuals and undervalued, often because it's quite difficult and complex, and the sort of the work of really getting to know the communities, the array of entities, and doing some of the orchestrating work as a funder. And then the last thing I just want to underscore is this, what I would say maybe is the organizational work of doing systems change, right? What does it take for you to convince your board to really transform a funding organization to operate in a different way? And my early career was all on leadership and organizational change and sort of the foundations of leading and transforming organizations. And that is super difficult under any conditions, but especially under these conditions when you're trying to get buy-in for a much more complex, uncertain, continually changing process. So really important work, not easy work.
Absolutely. I mean, I can only stress this. This is, I mean, the main learning is also that collaboration doesn't happen like this. I mean, you need to invest time and build relationships and understand the different motivations of everyone. Because, I mean, also for understand to ask, organization, nonprofits to collaborate. Come on and collaborate and we'll be very happy. But it doesn't happen like this. You have, it's time, you need space, physical space to also collaborate. It's something that's the engineering behind it is quite heavy. And if, as a funder, if you don't provide a space and the means to enable collaboration, then it's just not possible. It's not happening. So that's also learning we had. We also, the foundation at DPF decided to also create a space of, also reinforcing leadership, new leadership styles, and working on all these leverages where you can actually promote collaboration, because, it cannot just push on a button and it happens.
Thank you very much to both of you for this conversation. So we have a few questions. I would like to maybe give the floor. Don't hesitate to raise your hand if you want to add one to my colleagues Anne and then Marie-Stéphane, maybe. Anne, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you, Maria and Sylvia, for your great presentations. It was really fascinating. I have a question. Maria, you talked about the climate crisis, and I wanted to ask about how this systems thinking can apply to what kind of systems are we talking about? And I think when we talk about the climate crisis, it's not only talking about the problem, mapping the problem of education, of unemployment, but also how the whole society is a system and contributing to the crisis we're in. So how can we actually use systems thinking to, in a term, solve the climate crisis, which is like one of the biggest crises that humanity had to face?
Yeah, okay, that's a big question. Thank you, Anne. I mean, I think, right, so this is the challenge, right, with systems thinking, and especially around climate and sustainability, which, there's such a host of interlocking issues, right, is it can be overwhelming. Like, where do you begin? How do you bound things, right? Like you basically said, and I agree, like at some level, like this is everywhere. It touches every aspect of our lives. It's sort of the fundamental overarching systems challenge that we face, right, is the sustainability of our planet. And so you might say, like, okay, I throw up my hands, like where to begin, right? And so I think it can be helpful to sort of ground in a particular entry point or issue. Or so, for example, we did a program last year with a network of philanthropic organizations that none of them have an explicit climate mission, but climate intersects with every one of their missions. And so like their entry point, and a useful entry point there was, well, we're funding, democracy and human rights activities or whatever it may be. How does, what is that intersection? And that starts to open things up, right? Because it's going to be everywhere, but then it's sort of everywhere and nowhere, and you need to ground it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have many good questions in the chat. I would like to ask you, Marie-Stéphane, first to ask a question, and then I'll go back to the chat.
Yes, thank you very much, Arthur. I would like to make a few comments for having been myself very involved in system change when I was working at the Carasso Foundation. My first comment is that we are not a side of the system, and there is no one system. It's systems that are interrelated, and philanthropy is part of the system. And very often we forget that, and we can be, and don't forget that philanthropy is coming from capital. And the capital is part of many of the defaults of the systems. And sometimes it's not, you don't have many coherence between some philanthropy from corporate foundations, for instance, and where the money comes from. So we have to be aware and be very careful that philanthropy is not the good guy, I would say, and that we are part of the system for the better and the worst. So that was my first comment. The second one was related to what Maria said about the different models. And my question would be, in my experience, really, you can you can manage together the different models at different times. For instance, according to one specific issue that you have decided to focus on after the kind of work that Sylvia showed us of the mapping, etc. You can see that at one time experimentation would be very accurate, and then you need to mix it with research, and then at a certain time you need to have some scaling, and at another time advocacy, and sometimes it's all together in order to have the system change. So it's not, to my opinion, it's not one choice between five, but it's really to focus. I really like as well what you were saying about the stone and aiming at something. It's really, I was always saying that we have to be at our just place, in where we can act really when we have can have some impact, and really you can play with these different models according to what you are, to what the needs are on the ground, and really to focus or to aim at some specific issues. So that's why my two comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Stéphane. Any reactions maybe from Sylvia and maybe Maria? Does it resonate, Sylvia, with your own work at the foundation?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you have a toolbox, and you take the tool that's the most appropriate for what the challenge requires, as a response. And yeah, sometimes you're not able to do it yourself. You have to look at the toolbox of one partner of another foundation. That's also very important to know, the ecosystem. And I like when Marie-Stéphane said that we are part of a system. There's also the system of funders who's very dysfunctional in a way. We don't even know who's the one who's going to be there where we exit the projects. And also exiting a project is part of a system. You put, you actually bring some challenges also when you leave a project. So you also have to think of the system on how these organizations are going to be funded. So it's another system you have to build and be aware of. What are the strengths of others? What are other foundations doing? How can you collaborate in more, I would say, efficient way? Because that's something where you can absolutely, speed up on.
Thanks a lot, Sylvia. We have many questions in the chat, so if you don't mind, I will maybe group some of them. I think there are two good practical questions from both Anna and Caroline. So, with a lot of turnover in organizations, how do we make sure that knowledge about systems stays in the organization and does not leave with the people who've done the work? So are there any tools or methods that you recommend? And second question from Caroline, how do you see when there is a shift in a system? I know it's difficult to see short-term results, but maybe Sylvia, in your experience, how do you know that you're on the good path, right? So two practical questions. But of course, Maria, please feel free to address them. It's not only for Sylvia. Who wants to start, Maria or Sylvia?
So yeah, good questions. So first question about knowledge management. Yeah, it's a good question because all this takes time, and it's important to have time to build these relations. And as I mentioned, all these discussions we have with nonprofits, with co-funders, it's a lot based on personal interaction and trust building. And so that also has value. I think it's important to have teams that are able to sustain. So work a lot on client, keeping your teams as long as you can if they're good. I spent 10 years in this foundation, and after 10 years, I could see the results. I mean, so it's long term. And yeah, the tools, it's hard to answer this question because there's no perfect tool. I think it's more about a culture of sharing knowledge and being this type of conversation, being in collectives of funders, being, working with academics like we did, Arthur. It's also a way of, transferring all the knowledge, everything you see and you feel in the sector. So spending a lot of time on that, and also explaining to your board that you need this time. You need this time to collaborate, to create, these links and connections. And it's a culture of also keep on learning. And yeah, TPF also had this in mind to work on, this cultural shift. And then you also, of course, have digital tools that can help you, to manage and stock knowledge. And yeah, and that's something that you have to build depending on your organization. But it's a lot of, I would say, human interaction, and that will never be replaced by AI and other tools. So that's first question. And on the question, how do you know you're on the right path? This is, I believe in impact measurement, and I think it's very important, but in systems change, it's so long, it would require an amount of data which is quite impossible. So I think the main metric that helped us at DPF was just to see and make sure the organizations we support have progressed, you know, that they're stronger, their governance is improving, that they're able to address the problem and see some, you know, changes happening. But it's about monitoring and feeling and not really, you know, having tangible figures at this level. But I mean, that's the experience on employment. I mean, it's super complicated to analyze. And yeah, I think it's a lot about, you know, having these right conversations with your grantees.
Excellent, Sylvia. Maria, you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. I'll just add a few things. So I think, I mean, just on the issue of employees and people moving, I mean, I think this is sort of overused, but we just need to start thinking in terms of networks and communities, right? And so we talk about this at the center, at the school center, you know, all of our work is done with and through community. And that includes, you know, of course, our alums and the people who've been through our programs, but also the staff who are no longer with us, right? And so we, you know, we think very much about how we continue to maintain relationships, build ties, convene, bring people together, because really the knowledge doesn't sit in our staff only or mainly, it sits just as much in the network of people who we have interacted with over the years. And so it shifts what we think about as sort of like one of the core things we need to be doing, right? Is sort of actively connecting, building, convening those broader communities within which we're embedded. Because that's where the knowledge resides. Just on the measurement issue, so two things. So I think, you know, we need to start thinking differently about what's the ambition, right? Like, what does progress mean? So what are we trying to do? I mean, ultimately, we aspire to solve, but things are never solved. They're on a trajectory, right? They're improved, right? And so what we're trying to do is sort of set things in motion and learn from that, right? And so, and you know, one of my colleagues talks about the value of disrupting the system first, right? Don't look for root causes, just act, like treat the symptoms and figure out from that what's going on and what are the underlying dynamics. So shifting, like we can measure, like, are things changing? Are we learning from what's changing? And that's a very different approach to measuring. And in fact, another of my colleagues, Karim Harji, is doing some work with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors now on measuring systems change. And so much anticipated report, keep your eyes out for it in the fall. But I think that will help us start to have some language around, you know, how can we think differently about what measurement means when we're trying to measure systems level change.
Thank you so much. We are running a little bit out of time, but there is a great point by Cyril in the chat. I would like to you know, synthesize it. Maybe it's a little bit of a provocation for Sylvia. As a funder, instead of trying to find one superhero organization that would find you know, an excellent solution to change the system, wouldn't it be interesting to try to help a lot of solution providers, maybe at a smaller scale, to have a more systemic approach in their own activities? So would you like to comment on that, Sylvia?
Yes, of course. I like to be challenged. Well, my response is that philanthropy is about making choices. I mean, we don't have the extended amount of money that would be needed to solve every problem in the world. So you have to make choices. And of course, there are costs of opportunities when you have to make choices, but it depends. It's an equation where you have to know your size, your strengths, you know, the needs, you know, what you have access to. And this is a combination of elements that make you take this decision and make the decision. So I think there's value in both approaches that Cyril mentions. But yeah, it's a question of choices. And I think what from experiencing, you know, working with organizations, I see that these people trying to bring change in the system, they desperately need funding and really important resources. And if we can already help one to succeed, this is already a success. So yeah, that's a matter of choice. In this case, we decided to be bold and go for moonshots in one, a limited amount of organizations. But it was also a way to I would say, channel and focus, because our resources are also limited. We have a small team. We cannot analyze thousands of organizations. And so that's also, you know, a combination of different elements that make you, you know, take this way and this path.
Thank you, Sylvia. Maria, if you don't mind, I would like to ask you the other question from Cyril. Since you know, social entrepreneurs quite well, also I would like to, ask you as a funder, as a foundation, when you do, some systemic analysis of a problem, how do you make sure that you don't take more control over the nonprofits that you're supposed to help? For instance, are you not trying to use them as operators only, being, in the sense that if you are a systemic funder, you've done the systemic mapping yourself. So how do you make sure that this mindset is not a way to increase the imbalance of powers between funder and beneficiaries or grantees?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this. I saw this question in the chat and I think it's really important to address. So, right, I mean, I think this is super important, and the intent is not to shift the power dynamic even further towards the funder side, right? But very much to have it be a collaboration, right? And so the value that a funder can bring is in part having the resources to do some of the systems mapping work, having the resources to connect different operating organizations, to bring them together, to convene. And it's not to say, here's how to do it, but to create the space for the organizations that are working on the ground to collectively address the issue and to provide funding for working together on an issue. And how do you learn about, what are the complexities and relationships and power dynamics, and by going and learning by again apprenticing with the problem, by working on the ground, by listening to the nonprofits that you may be providing funding to. And so it's not at all meant to be, or it shouldn't be a sort of like a parachute from the top, or sort of learn about it from a 50,000-foot level, but the learning has to come from listening to social enterprises, people in the communities on the ground that you're trying to support. And so that's what, I think it's all in sort of how it's implemented. I just give you an example from one of the funders that we work with, and thinking about, it starts from them trying to understand the entities that they support. What are those entities trying to accomplish, right? And what are the problems that they see? What is their understanding of the issues they're working on, and what it takes to address it? And so it flips the dynamic, if you will. What would those operating organizations see as the way to measure success? How are they learning, et cetera? So the funder asking questions more than giving directives.
Okay, it's almost time now. So I would like to, again, thank Sylvia and Maria very much for their presentations today and the great conversation that we've had. So it was a pleasure to have you both as our guests. Thank you, Elsa, for engaging also our speakers, and for all of you who asked questions in the chat. We shared a lot of resources, and again, we will do a replay of this webinar, so you will have more opportunities to share this knowledge with colleagues and others. Just 1 second to tell you about 2 upcoming events and piece of news at the Philanthropy Chair at ESSEC Business School. So this is for our French-speaking audience. We released the 31st episode of our podcast on trust-based philanthropy. So don't hesitate to connect to your platform to listen to podcasts. The podcast series is called La Philanthropie en question, and you can find the 31st episode for this month. And we also just released a collective book called Les mots qui disent la philanthropie. I had the pleasure to be one of the editors of this book at the Odile Jacob Publishing House. We have a book launch and a breakfast in Paris on July 4th. at 8:30. So if you want to be invited and if you want to know more about our events, please sign up for our mailing list. You can find that easily on the chair's website. And I will be happy to meet you if you are in Paris to talk about this book and share a few, moments together, coffee and croissant. And I'll be very happy to see you in person on July 4th. Thanks a lot again to all of you. It's time to go back to work for most of us and to have lunch for some of you. Sylvia, Maria, again, a big thank you. And we will see you all very soon. The next Lunch and Learn webinar will probably happen in September and October. So stay tuned and enjoy the summer for all of you. Thanks a lot.